Right. Mercy. I love mercy. Mercy is something I can get into mercy.
Come on.
Mercy is a subject that I can get into, so I'm glad that we have this theme this month because mercy changed my life. I'm just going to put it right out there. Mercy changed my life. Now, you may not understand. You may have never had the need to call upon somebody's mercy. That's okay. I did. I have. And I know what that's like. And I began telling one story in our newsletter this past month, but I left out some of the critical details. So I want to tell you a little bit more about it. I don't know what it was like, where you grew up, when you grew up, but I used to get bullied quite a lot. I'd get tripped on my way down Jock Hall. That was where all the athletes hung out during the lunch period. It was usually the upperclassmen who would be tripping us freshmen and sophomores as we came down the hallway. Now, occasionally I'd get shaken down for some of my lunch money or teased because I didn't have the right kind of tennis shoes that all the cool kids were wearing. That was a big deal back then. So I did what any other intimidated, insecure young boy might do in response. I sometimes picked on the kids who were smaller than me. You know, at that time, that seemed like the natural order of things. If you were bigger, you picked on the kids that were smaller. And when I could get away with being the tormentor, I figured I'd do my part to continue the cycle of abuse. To be a teenager again, huh? I know we got some here right now. Plus, I had to do something to recover my lunch money or I'd starve. So my point being that I'm a minister today partially to atone for the sins of my youth. And that's not all a joke. There's some real things. But one day, I'm going to tell you one story about when I was 14, and I walked into a classroom, and I noticed that the janitor had left on the windowsill a can of wasp spray. And lo and behold, the teacher was late, and there he was, this young freshman who I used to like to tease. He was an easy target. And so I took the can of wasp spray, feeling cocky, and I grabbed it, and I started chasing him around the room, saying, hold still, you got wasp in your hair. Hold on, let me get him out. Just stop right there. Of course, he was running and scattering, and I thought I was so big and powerful and smart and cool. And it was all fun and games until I bumped into a desk and accidentally pressed down on the nozzle, and some sprayed out and got into his eyes. He immediately started to scream, and he grabbed his eyes, and he barreled over, and right then the teacher came walking into the room, and he was brought to the nurse, and I was sent to the principal's office. Now, I felt like I had just swallowed a bar of soap, if you know how that feels. Now, it wasn't because I was being sent to the principal's office, because I was used to being sent to the principal's office back then. As a matter of fact, I was down there so often, I was on first-name basis with all the secretaries, right? But this was, I'm just confessing a little bit this morning. But this time, it was different because I had really, really messed up. I mean, this kid could be blind. His eyes could be damaged for the rest of his life. There was no excuse. I was being a bully. I was picking on him. Someone's life might change severely because of my actions. And I was sure I was going to be suspended and probably expelled. This was like the last straw. And once you push it to that point, it's a little different than being called down to the principal's office for some minor infraction. So I just wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out. I was rehearsing as I was sitting there waiting to go in and see the principal. I was rehearsing what I was going to say to him and to my parents. You know, when the principal called me into his office and I stood before his imposing desk, I felt about 3 feet tall as I explained what happened, and then the words that he uttered changed my life. Now, this was even before we knew whether the boy was going to be okay. He said, Marlin, you're right. That was foolish, that was stupid, and that was very dangerous what you did. And I also know you well enough to know that you did not do that with malice of bad intent. I know you would never do something like that. And in fact, I'll make sure to tell his parents the same thing. Now, at that moment, when I thought that my entire life was about to be changed forever, it was, just for a completely different reason and in a completely different way than I expected. I was given a second chance. But more importantly, I could feel what it was like to be trusted and respected. And at that moment, when I was feeling at my absolute lowest, I went into that office of the principal feeling stupid, feeling clumsy, feeling mean, feeling ashamed of myself. And I left with a sense that the principal could see that deep inside I was a person with character and integrity. Now, instead of telling me I was good for nothing, which I would have been happy to accept and believe at that point in my life, he affirmed me at a deep level of who I am. I was in shock, but I remember that I did not want to lose that feeling, and it changed who I was and how I wanted to be in the world. Now, thank God that the boy was okay, and I apologized, and he accepted it, and he never had a problem with me after that. Now, relationships have the power to transform our lives, for good and for ill. Right? And mercy has an important place in this. Sometimes we don't realize that. I don't know if you've ever noticed that in our hymnal, and even I think we put that up on the screen, whenever we sing Amazing Grace, the song in our hymnal, there's a little asterisk over one of the words, and then there's an option for replacing it when you sing it here in this church. And you can change the words from Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, into that saved a soul like me. Right now, some Unitarians resent being labeled a wretch. It's understandable, but not me. I sing wretch. I do, because I know what it feels like to feel like a wretch, to act like a wretch, and not to be punished, but to experience grace instead of punishment. Do you know that feeling? I don't know if you know that feeling. I really don't know, and that's okay. But I know that I'm in touch with my inner wretch. Turn to the person next to you and say, are you in touch with your inner wretch? You need to get in touch with your inner wretch. Now, it's not just this one story, but you get the idea. But I also realize that you may not know what it feels like to need grace or mercy. You know, you may not be able to relate to that sense of feeling like a wretch, and that's okay. More power to you. And I also know that not everybody likes the idea of mercy, of letting people off the hook. And that's understandable. Because to be fair, letting people off the hook is not always the right thing to do. So how do we know? Well, giving someone a second chance is just that. It's a second chance. It's not a third chance, not a fourth chance, certainly not a fifth chance or a 50th chance. Right? But when a person in our lives has an active addiction, has chronic financial problems and aren't dealing with them, and other chronic character issues, then mercy can quickly become codependency and enabling. It's not really mercy. That's not mercy. Right? In which case, it's a false sense of being merciful. We think we're being merciful, and what we're doing is we're enabling somebody's bad behavior. Repeatedly bailing someone out of jail, or out of their financial problems or out of tight spots that they keep getting themselves into again and again and again. It stops being mercy, and it starts helping the person, and it actually starts destroying everybody, including you. You may not know what I'm talking about, but you know how it goes when someone is given one more chance, and then another, and then another, and then another, but it doesn't make them change. Accepting people's rationalizations for their bad behavior is not mercy, it's stupidity. And it can be an addiction in itself. Think about this. Pretty soon, the person who thinks that he or she is being merciful, right, finds that they're becoming preoccupied with the problems of this problem person in their lives. Now they're obsessing about it. Now they're thinking about it constantly. Now it's all of a sudden driving their lives. Enabling is its own kind of addiction. And it'll get you. It's an addiction. You know, in addiction, right, an addict continues to do a behavior over and over and over again, drugs, gambling, whatever it is, despite serious negative consequences in their lives, right? Well, the enabler also keeps enabling, and despite serious consequences in their own lives for that action. An addict keeps using despite emotional, financial, sometimes legal problems, and enablers keep enabling despite their own financial, emotional, and sometimes even legal problems. It's an addiction. It's another kind of an addiction. Being in a relationship with someone who's actively an addict, we can get sucked in and become an addict ourselves and create a system of addiction that destroys everybody. The enabler can't seem to stop destroying. You know, the addict can't stop destroying their life, acting in a way that destroys their life. The enabler can't stop acting in a way that's destroying their life by continuing to enable. The addict begins to have problems at work. So does the enabler, because the enabler starts losing concentration on the job because they're always thinking about staying up nights, not sleeping well, concentrating about the problem person and their problems. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? All right, I'm just checking because I see this all the time. All the time. Now, pretty soon, it's not just the addict, but the enabler who's suffering from physical symptoms like headaches and stomach aches and stress. Now the enabler has an obsession. It's not a drug, but it's their preoccupation, right, with this problem person and their problems until it starts to dominate their thoughts and destroy their own lives. And pretty soon it leads to a sense of hopelessness and despair. And then everybody's in trouble. Now, while the addict's tolerance for the drug just keeps getting greater and greater and greater, the enabler's tolerance for bad behavior keeps getting greater and greater and greater. You see how this works? Enabling is an addiction. And just like addicts, enablers don't often see that they have a problem, or they're not willing to admit that they have a problem and they're part of the problem. Now, if it's allowed to continue, forget about it. Now, this is not mercy. This is codependence. It's important to know the distinction because mercy gets a bad rap because people don't know the difference. Now, here's the thing. Mercy is a decision to choose connection over disconnection. All right, let's look back at the story of Joseph and his brothers for a moment from the book of Genesis. Joseph was about 17 years old when his jealous brothers threw him down a well. Barbara forgot to tell us the kids that part of the story. Huh? We'll have mercy upon you for that. It's probably a good decision. But then they sold their brother into slavery. Then they told their dad, they brought his bloody robe, they bloodied it up with some goat's blood or something. They brought it to his father and told him that he was dead. Now, fast forward many years, and unbeknownst to their brothers, Joseph's become a wealthy, powerful leader in Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh himself. And then when the famine strikes Israel, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt looking for some form of survival. And lo and behold, they find themselves begging and bowing before their brother Joseph. But they don't recognize that it's Joseph. This is the last place they'd expect to see Joseph, right? In the end, Joseph decides that instead of revenge, instead of payback, which would be totally justified after the victimization that he experienced, the loss of his childhood with his family and his father who loved him, instead of payback, he chose mercy. He chose to reconnect with his family and with his brothers, to give them a second chance. Now, by the end of the story, they're all united, their father, and that's what he really wanted. And this is the point of mercy. The point is to choose connection over estrangement. The point is to seek wholeness rather than separation. That's what we all want. Now, in my story from high school, it was about finding a connection to myself, within myself, to my own sense of goodness, to my own sense of who I am and who I could be, rather than leaving me broken and disconnected and dismembered. That principle did me a great favor by showing me mercy in that moment. It gave me a chance to see what was possible for my life, and I never wanted to lose that again. Not that I didn't make more mistakes after that, but I had a different sense of who I was and who I could be, because an adult who I trusted and respected, who'd seen me in bad situations, said, no, deep down, that's not who you are. Wow, as a young person, to be seen by an adult in that way, it's incredible. So in the Joseph story, it's his family, right? He decides to be kind, and he decides to have a family back, and he does, instead of living the rest of his life lonely, maybe powerful, maybe with all the money in the world, but he doesn't have his family because he couldn't forgive, he couldn't be merciful. Now, in the case of South Africa, when apartheid ended 20 years ago, now remember, apartheid was a system in South Africa that made the minority, the white South Africans, the rulers of the country for centuries, right? While the majority, the black South Africans, could not vote, they could not go many places, they could not get certain jobs, they could not go to certain schools. The society was racist, it was violent, it was unjust, and it was a lot like segregated America before 1960s. The greatest fear that white South Africans had was that when their black adversaries gained power, that they would take their revenge out for the decades of abuse and cruelty and killing perpetrated upon them and their children and their grandchildren and their grandfathers and their parents and everybody in all the years and all the decades and all the generations. They were sure if the tables turned, they were going to be in big trouble. And what happened? Black South Africans gave us the greatest example of communal mercy ever seen in human history. Think about that. When Nelson Mandela was freed after 27 years in prison for opposing apartheid, 27 years, locked up in a cage like an animal. I take that back. We wouldn't even lock an animal up for 27 years in a cage. When Mandela was finally freed, after losing all those years, he could have called for the vengeance and for retribution, and he did not. He called for forgiveness. It's incredible. He called upon his old friend Bishop Desmond Tutu, and he asked him to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The rules were simple. The perpetrators had to tell the truth, the whole truth, and if they did, their victims were given the opportunity to forgive, and they were also given the chance for total amnesty for what they'd done. Unbelievable, unprecedented in human history. In other words, mercy. Right? Now, many of the atrocities were truly horrific. If you've ever read the reports, if you've ever read about what happened during those times, especially towards the end in those last couple of decades when things were starting to change, and a policeman at the trials, at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, were set up kind of like a trial. A policeman named Vanderbroek, you might have read about this, he told how he and his fellow officers, police officers, shot an 18-year-old youth and then burnt his body. And he went on. He went on to explain that 8 years later, he and other police officers went back to the home, and they took the father of the boy and forced his wife to watch as they incinerated him. It's hard to even believe. Now, she was in court to hear his confession. And she was asked by the judge what she wanted. She said she wanted Vanderbroek to go to the place where they burned her husband's body and to collect the dust and bring it to her so that she could finally give him a proper burial. And Vanderbroek agreed. And Mr. Vanderbroek, then she added one more request. She said, Mr. Vanderbroek has taken my entire family away from me, and now I have no one. But I still have a lot of love to give. Twice a month, I would like for him to come to the ghetto where I live and spend the day with me so I can be his mother. And this elderly woman said, and I would like Mr. Vanderbroek to know that he is forgiven by God and that I forgive him too. And I would like to embrace him so that he may know that my forgiveness is real. And as she started walking across the courtroom to the witness stand, people around started singing Amazing Grace as this elderly woman made her way to give him a hug. Now, Vanderbroek did not hear the hymn because he fainted, completely overwhelmed. Our relationships have the power to transform us and transform others. Mercy is one of the most profound tools that we have in order to do it, and one of the most divine. Now, our forebears, this church's forebears, the Universalists, would say, if we were mortals, if we mere mortals have the capacity to be so merciful and forgiving, how much more capable is God? You hear me? Universalists claim that God is merciful, and therefore God will always choose love and connection, always, over estrangement and separation. And that's why they proclaimed that there is no hell. If we mere mortals can open our hearts enough to forgive people who have inflicted unforgettable damage upon us, would God be so vengeful as to inflict endless suffering and torment and torture upon everyone who has failed on life's complicated journey? That's not God. How could Jesus tell us to love and forgive our enemies and God not be so forgiving? Are we more forgiving than God? My colleague Forrest Church says, we can sift a spoonful of evidence for hell out of the Bible, even as we can ladle out dozens of arguments for slavery. Neither, however, meets the requirements of the biblical spirit, whose imperative is love. In the end, it's love that is the root of mercy. And if there is one purpose that makes being alive worthwhile, it's learning how to love. That's why I believe we're here, to learn how to love. And while some people might argue that God is not love, we'll all agree that love is divine. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. We've no less days to shout God's praise than when we first began. So don't just sing, but shout God's praise. Shout aloud for glory. Brother, sister, mourner, friend. All who know what I'm talking about, shout glory, hallelujah. All right. Shout, Lord, have mercy. Shout, praise life. Shout, praise God. Turn to somebody and say, you've got a friend. Say, you've got a friend in need. Say, you got a friend indeed. Say, you've got a friend in me. All right. Have mercy. I love you. God bless you. Amen.